Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, a place where we demystify complex technologies every day and provide real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping entire industries. But we do all this in a language that everyone can understand. And in today's episode, I've invited Nathan Howe back onto the podcast from a company called Zscaler, or Zscaler, depending on where you're listening to me in the world today. And Nathan is going to discuss how AI and ML-based capabilities can secure and manage cloud infrastructure, sensitive data, and native applications deployed across multi-cloud environments. And we're also going to discuss Zscaler's recent ransomware report, which reveals an 80% increase in ransomware attacks year over year. And that report analyses more than a year's worth of data from the largest security cloud in the world. And just to bring that to life a little, it processes more than 200 billion daily transactions and 150 million daily blocked attacks from the Zscaler Zero Trust Exchange. But I've revealed far too much already, haven't I? So it's time for me to activate the connection between myself here in the UK and Nathan in Italy, so you can join us and we can get today's conversation started. So a massive warm welcome back to the show. We last spoke in, I think it was last May, about Security Service Edge, but can you remind the listeners with a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, great to be back, Neil. Thanks for having me. Nathan Howe is my name. So I'm the Vice President of Emerging Technologies and 5G here at Zscaler. So I get to work on all the cool stuff, like I mentioned last time, 5G edge compute, all of the Zero Trust initiatives, all the SSE stuff, and even now talking about the machine learning and those sort of risks that are popping up. So a lot of fun stuff is really my domain.
Excellent. And since we last spoke, I've been reading a lot about how lean running IT and security teams are actually experiencing security alert fatigue with those increasing exposure to real-time threats, and often don't have the resources or the skills to investigate and respond to the mounting volume of threats. And I remember from my time in IT as well, the sheer scale and volume of those alerts, it's almost impossible to keep up with them sometimes. But can you expand on the scale of the problem that you've been seeing here?
Absolutely. It's something I love talking about, because if anyone's ever taken a second to open up a log file and just look at the enormity of information in there, and then you think about that in terms of every time you click a button, every time someone opens a web page, or all these things, just the sheer amount of logs that are being created to basically state that incremental something happened at this time. There's a log or a record that are being recorded. And then to try and understand all of those different types of logs together in terms of when an attack happens becomes very, very challenging for anyone to, first of all, understand the breadth of those things. But then also, not only are we dealing with a world where everyone's connected and there's more devices being connected, there's a lot more attackers out there too. So there's a lot of kids and a lot of people trying to take advantage of weak links. And so there's obviously going to be a lot of logs, an infinite amount of logs being generated. And so it's part of that wider security strategy we need to think about is, well, I need to consider my full attack chain. What would be the threats I have to deal with? And that becomes, again, larger and larger and larger as enterprises move to more, as we're talking about, is working from home, people being anywhere. There's more infrastructure to be considered. So that becomes very challenging for anyone to properly understand. And of course, when you have technologies like SIEMs and SOC organizations, security operations teams built around analyzing and monitoring and alerting on this information, there's just so much they have to deal with that it becomes, as you said, it's that almost fatigue of seeing that red light flashing in the corner. And then the question comes up, well, is that really a red light, or is it just another fake example or a possible example? And that drives another big security question as well. What is really an alert? What is really an incident versus not? So you can imagine the scale and that it has to be comprehended, but then also the ability to then act on that becomes quite challenging for large enterprises as well. So it's not an easy place to be, that's for sure.
And I think for any team or individual, the technology is that good now. It's generating more and more alerts. And with hundreds of alerts being generated every day, I just don't think a single human or team have the resources to be able to deal and investigate every single one of those. But of course, now humans don't have to do all that. So what role do you see artificial intelligence and machine learning based capabilities? What role do you see them in helping to secure and manage things like cloud infrastructure, sensitive data, native applications that are deployed across multi-cloud environments? Because it's so complex now, isn't it?
Yeah, but you mentioned, I think, one thing that does allow for some sort of common denominator, which is the idea of cloud infrastructure. If you think about it, historically, every company who built its own IT organization and its own services dealt with their own set of services and logs and controls that were managed in different ways. And as we've seen this uptick of companies going to the cloud, adopting to cloud infrastructure, they are moving to standardized ways of working. So your logs that you get from, let's just say, customer A in Amazon is the same set of logs that customer B would have if they're both using the same services in Amazon. Of course, maybe there'd be some context that would change, but ultimately the insight would be there. And so there is certainly a unification of it. The problem is, though, it's actually causing more logs to be generated, so it can be lost within the noise. So the drive of transformation to adopt the cloud is actually obviously going in the right direction for a lot of good things. But then the real challenge is not, to be honest with you, it's not a technology or a security our problem. It's more actually around the strategy of an enterprise. And what I mean by that is a company needs to say, okay, I need to consume these services. If I consume these services for my business, my drive for, I don't know, IoT services, sending logs to Azure IoT Edge, those logs are being consumed. But what is the strategy for those logs? Is it to be more effective with the outcome of those IT sensors, or is it just to have the logs? And the reason why I use those kind of bookend examples is that strategy will then drive the outcome of how to use the logs, what to use them for, and then where to consume them appropriately in the right security solutions. And we've had a large set of, let's say, in industry security standards around this standardization of logging. We can see that with things like the MITRE attack framework, where we can categorize the logs very simply. This is coming out of a need to simplify those things. To your point earlier, Neil, about ML and AI falling into this, there are things that become repetitive, can be very simply and easily. An old joke we used to have, I think, from many years ago was somebody wrote a T-shirt that said, "Please be quiet, or I will replace you with a simple Perl script." And I think that's the kind of idea here is in these alerts, you can simplify a lot of it by looking for normalization, of course. But then there are categories and ways that we can fit things into, but then understanding those categories in the overall context of an attack becomes the power artificial intelligence or machine learning comes in. And the key here is to contextualize that information. So understand that if an incident A happens, then let's go back in time and look at all the logs that happened before incident A, and then contextualize that in relation to that user, that machine, all this information that's being pulled in to help provide content and context, and then decide an outcome based upon that. That is not going to be black and white and not a simple Perl script, but be much more of an assessment of at the time, at the moment when all of these logs are being generated. And so that in itself is enormously beneficial and really helps simplify a lot of those challenges that enterprises have. And the best thing about all of this is it can be offered as a service rather than an enterprise having to run that themselves and configure it. It can be run in a cloud service. And so it's just another service to consume and get a good outcome from.
And I think for every business leader listening, what they're looking at doing, or the utopia that they'd love to end up at, is freeing up IT and security teams from troubleshooting to actually focus on preventing attacks. So with that in mind, do you, have any examples of how to address these challenges by providing something like a one-click root cause analysis that instantly identifies the issues behind those poor digital experiences? Do you have any real-world examples of how that's happening?
Well, absolutely. I think the biggest challenge is that enterprises are not all IT companies. Not every company in the world is an IT specialist. And they need to be able to consume IT to find a competitive advantage, to automate processes or whatever it might be. And now we can start consuming these services without having to have the enterprises be specialists in that. And so if you look at that in terms of what are the sets of services that are out there, the complexity that enterprises face is really, really large. So if you think about it, historically, they would have, if you had an old company, they would have had their own internal infrastructure. They may have had some switches, some routers. That was all one central place of logging. And now, with everybody working from home or remotely in Italy or wherever, there's a lot more information being generated by different sets of infrastructure that's not necessarily connected to the enterprise, but there's a lot of information being generated around things that are not company related. And so a company needs to, as you roughly said, we need to optimize the IT staff so they're not chasing a needle in a haystack when somebody's working from home. They need to get the factual information about what's happening. At the same time, that sheer number of alerts or information that's being generated actually is very beneficial. And a good example I'll give you into that real world use case is that I think it was last week, and pardon me, I'm coming off PTO, so I'm not really sure if it was last week or the week before. There was an outage with Google. So Google search had a problem. It was spitting back a 502 error to users. I think it was estimated around 50,000 users received this. Now, if you have a number of nodes out there on the internet that are consistently testing major services like Google, like Microsoft Teams, and Zoom, and so forth, and you can see that the performance is having a problem, or the service is having a problem, you can start to drive insight as to why. The good thing is if you have all of your employees running that same monitoring software, then you now have every single employee's device is a monitoring node. And you can start to see the overall experience, and not just from the individual, but across the entirety of the network flow. Because if you think about it, you and I, Neil, are sitting in different parts of the world. And as our traffic is coming together in this podcast, it's being brought across all this infrastructure and all these hops along the way to be analyzed. They provide information, connecting you and I together. And that allows for a lot of insight. And if we can harness that insight and we can start painting a picture. So that Google outage that we talk about, whilst it was momentary, still had an impact. And what we were able to do actually with Zscaler is actually see it in live time, because we have these monitoring services on all of our clients, all of the Zscaler employees monitoring the internet, all of our services that we consume, including Google. And we could see there was an issue. And so we're actually able to quickly see there was a problem, flag it. And that meant we no longer had the problem of like, oh, there's a problem. What is the problem? It was, oh, there's a problem with Google, where we see that, we'll let you know when it comes back. So it allows for enterprises to make a very definitive communication to their employees to know that the problem is not perhaps their Wi-Fi, or maybe it is their Wi-Fi, or whether it's something else along the way. You remove those troubleshooting stages and allow for an easier picture to be painted and for a solution to be found, and ultimately resolve the end user solution so they're back and working without any problems. And I think that's the goal, is to leverage that data set that we are obviously creating more and more of to then pull it into an intelligent place and understand the benefits to the enterprise.
And I think I also read that Google outage was caused by a software update. So it's good to know that even Google have trouble with change management, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, I also read in Zscaler's recent ransomware report that there's actually an 80% increase in ransomware attacks year over year, which is a phenomenal figure. So can you tell me more about that report and who it was that you surveyed?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting report from our Threat Labs team. That's Threat Labs with a Z at the end, or a Z, depending on the country you're in. I should say Z is it's an American company, but my Australian heritage always has to go back to Z. So yeah, this is where we actually looked into and not only our customer base, but also the threats that we see on the internet. And there's quite a bit of information that you can consume out there. So you said, 80% of the growth of year on year. And this is really primarily focused on the top 11 ransomware groups. So we were looking at information across not only our customer base, but also working with our security partners around the world to figure out not only the actual attack vectors, but also looking for the payloads that may be passing through our customer infrastructure or passing through our Zscaler cloud as part of the protection we provide to our customers. And this gives us an incredible insight into not only the attacks, but also what may be happening inside and outside of that. And one of the things I love about this ransomware review, but also is the overall scope of risk related to ransomware attacks, is looking at, obviously, when an incident happens and ransomware is installed, we see that there is something happening. Obviously, a device is being encrypted, a service is being stopped, or whatever. But that moment allows us then to say, well, hold on, what happened before that? Let's look historically at what happened and start understanding very quickly what is the actual initial attack vectors that brought us to this point. So not only can we help our customers and identify this information as part of this overall ransomware attack and risk assessment review, but also allow them, we're working with them in live to go back and saying, well, let's find out what that risk is. And can we start mitigating that risk earlier so that you don't have those risks in the future when that comes down the pipe, when there's another attack. And obviously there's going to be more and more of those attacks as we go on in the world.
And I'm curious, are certain industries more susceptible to these attacks than others? Are there any being targeted more by cyber criminals, or is it right across the board?
So before I say anything specific about any industry, I think it's probably worthwhile stating that any computer, any device, any company that is connected to the internet has to be aware of a ransomware threat. It is something that has to be considered as part of their risk management. I think that's very clear. And honestly, anyone that has service on the internet, anything connected, is part of their attack surface. So we need to ensure that when customers are thinking about this risk and enterprises are thinking about this risk, they need to know what they have exposed to the internet, understand what their attack surface is. Now, to answer your question, there is really two paths towards, I would say, these attacks and where they're going. There's the opportunistic attackers who are just looking for anything and everything to try and attack and exploit. And there's an entire marketplaces about that. Online, you can go on the dark web and find entire, not ransomware crews, but attacking crews that are going out, finding these weak, let's say low-hanging fruits, exploiting them, and then telling the ransomware crews, hey, we've found this company that is, we've managed to breach them. If you want the keys to these guys, you pay us a fee, we'll give you the key, and off you go do your ransomware. So the low-hanging fruit is always going to be a concern. I think that's one we all have to be aware of. But beyond that, I think this is the one we're all much more, the area we're focused on is definitely the targeted attacks, the more strategic attackers. And that's the things that are primarily right now focused around areas where they can inflict the most pain, because if they inflict the most pain, there's a better chance of a payoff from that ransom, so to speak. And primarily right now, we're seeing, if you look at not just the IT industry, but the global industry, we're seeing the areas of manufacturing, supply chain, and critical infrastructure really being the three main areas that are being targeted. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, as I mentioned, the ability to put pressure on them because they are part of an important part of a country, a process, a delivery, manufacturing, et cetera. But also because a lot of these solutions or these organizations that fit in those categories historically have legacy infrastructure, old IT, old OT. And therefore, as I said before, sometimes falling into that low-hanging fruit. So the main areas here are those that have attack surfaces, of course, that are easily exploited, and then those that are being specifically targeted. And the specifically targeted ones tend to come through more of a ransomware phishing campaign, that less a breach of a low-hanging fruit, because obviously the more specific ones are having more interest from not only attackers, but government regulators to protect those ecosystems as well. But yeah, that would be my dichotomy of the ransomware world is the opportunistic ones and the strategic ones.
And just to bring to life some of what you just talked about there, can you possibly expand on some of the damage caused by double extortion and supply chain attacks? Because the impacts just ripple around the world, don't they?
They absolutely do. And it's actually quite interesting when I was sitting with some friends recently on vacation watching some ships go up and down an ocean. And I was kind of explaining to them that, hey, these ships have multiple things on them. They have like there's car parts or there's plastics or whatever they are. And they're all part of a global system that all have an impact on other companies. So if one of these ships gets stopped, like it's the situation right now in Europe with the droughts, obviously ships not able to pass through the rivers, then that company who's shipping it can't obviously deliver it, therefore they can't get paid. So that's one problem. But then if the companies who are reliant on those services, the plastic or the car parts can't perform their job because they haven't got the supplies. And so one incident in one of these, an IT incident in one of these companies has a similar effect. And we need to, at a high level, there's really three main areas of extortion. Of course, everyone knows the simple ransomware extortion where they'll turn your information unusable, they'll encrypt your hard drive and then ransom you for money and give you the keys back if you're lucky. But then the double extortion, as you mentioned before, Neil, is where not only are they stealing, they're hacking you and encrypting your data, but they're actually stealing it first. So that then they can use that information either to say, we'll threaten the release of this, and that can be the case in, obviously, if it's highly sensitive information, intellectual property can be a concern. But also, sometimes that information is then being used to inflict a third level of extortion, which is perhaps finding weaknesses in more infrastructure, or possibly taking customer data and then using that to ransom your customers. And so any of these, all three of them, when used, has an impact on the enterprise that's being attacked, but also has an impact on what that enterprise is delivering. And so, to my analogy of the rivers in Europe at the moment, if the company cannot do its job and have its services delivered to its end customers, those end customers can't do their job, and the rippling effect happens way beyond the initial attack vector, which should have everyone's eyes focused solely on the ball and the ears all pick up to go and chase after this. But that's a big issue we have to focus on.
And I'm curious, did anything at all surprise you in the report? Because obviously you're right in the heart of this space, so I'm curious if anything jumped out on the page and surprised you.
I would say probably the most, I guess it wasn't surprising, but it was, I guess, to be expected. I didn't realize it. I was like, oh yeah, of course, that makes sense. But the opportunistic nature of the attackers. I mentioned some are strategic, and there's definitely a strategic aspect out there. But there's so many of them that just will find an open VPN that's not been patched in 5 years, or we found an old web service that hasn't been replaced, or whatever it is. And it's so opportunistic. So it comes back to that idea of the attack surface and understanding that what an enterprise has, and remediating or protecting or mitigating as best as possible. But the other thing is also, I'd say, is probably the technical attacks we're seeing tend to follow a certain geopolitical directions as well. So obviously, as we've seen the Russian-Ukraine conflict, let's say, continue, we've seen obviously a number of attacks that are related to that as well. So there's definitely related, I'd say, within the political sphere, the geopolitical sphere, that are similar, whether it be, and I'm not speaking with any authority on who it's doing, but whether it could be related to the government, or it could be retribution from let's say, the anonymous hackers of the world, or whomever it might be. There is certain, when something jumps in the news, it's certainly an area where we see an influx of that kind of geopolitical focus. I will say that I mentioned a bit earlier, the other area that really became a focus to me was the idea of targeting critical infrastructure and services, mainly, as I mentioned before, on the idea of putting pressure on these enterprises, because they're already under substantial pressure to deliver their services. And if all of a sudden this happens, this makes it even more reason just to pay the ransom and move on. I think that's, again, very opportunistic of the attackers.
And I'm conscious we have focused a little on some of the bad things out there, but there is a lot to be hopeful about. So what makes you hopeful about the future?
Well, first and foremost, my parents know about ransomware. And if they know about ransomware, then the information is getting out there to the world, which is in the common knowledge space, which is great. And people are trying to think about ways to protect themselves. I think that's really good. I think beyond that, other positives that we're seeing a legislative and at least government kind of direction and shift with this. We saw this from the White House last year around protecting critical infrastructure. We're seeing a lot more focus on the idea of delivering zero trust. And zero trust, in a very simple sense, is ensuring only the right initiator gets access to the right service and nothing else. It doesn't matter about the firewall or the infrastructure or the network or the database. All that doesn't matter. You have to be an authorized entity, initiator, to get to that destination and to access that application or whatever it might be. I think that direction itself, though, is certainly driving a real focus in the industry as to how do we do things better and how do we move away from the reliance on that interconnected everything, which unfortunately is if we look at it at its crux, ransomware is a byproduct of the fact that we all share one global network, which is the internet. And that internet is obviously full of good things and bad things, but as we drive down the zero trust mechanism, it means that we want to ensure proper validation of access going to the right application, the authorized application, and that becomes a great initiative that will help protect us in that wild, wild west that is the internet today. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of positives, not just from the government side, as I mentioned. My parents know about it, which is fantastic. I mean, they listen to me on the phone call on the weekend, every weekend, so that's probably why. But I think there's a lot of knowledge being shared about this, not just in security or internal environments. And I think there's a lot of activity driving this in the right direction to counteract ransomware actors.
Fantastic. And a big thank you for joining me for a second time on the podcast, for sharing your time with me and sharing some of your insights. And I don't know, I've been thinking of ways to try and thank you for your time. Now, bearing in mind some of the biggest names in business, VC funding and tech have either been guests on this show or might even listen to the podcast. Is there a person that you would love to have a private breakfast or lunch with, and why? And we'll send it out into the universe because he or she might just hear you. So who are you going to go with?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this and I've got a few options, but I came down to one who's also a fellow podcaster like yourself. A gentleman's name is Brian McCullough. Brian runs the Tech Meme Ride Home podcast, but also the Tech Meme Ride Home investment fund as well. And I think his insight into the industry, not just security, but across the entire technical industry, from everything from the Facebooks and Metas through the Googles and Alphabets, but right through to venture capital and investment is really interesting. So I'd love to have, let's say, a coffee, a beer, even a bottle of wine with Brian and pick his brain one day. So I look forward to that one day. So thank you for the opportunity to send that out to the ether.
Fantastic. Well, we've sent that out there now. So Brian, if you're listening, you know what to do. But for everyone listening, can you just remind the listeners of where they can find out more information about Zscaler, contact your team, and maybe look into that report that we've talked about too?
Yeah, so the best place to go is zscaler.com/threatlabs. And again, that's with the ZZ at the end. Or zscaler.com/threatlabs with a Z. Probably should do it in both vernaculars. And from there, you can actually look into a number of our dashboards, give insights to our customers on what's going on not just within our cloud, but what we see across the overall security landscape as well.
Well, I cannot thank you enough for coming back and talking about which industries are being targeted most by cyber criminals, also explaining the damage caused by double extortion and supply chain attacks, etc., as well as the most active ransomware groups operating today, but more than anything for offering a little bit of hope and how we're heading in the right direction. So a big thank you for sharing that with me today.
My pleasure, Neil. Thank you so much for having me back. I look forward to the third time.
As I said at the very beginning of the podcast, I still remember from my IT days a team of people going through checks and alerts as soon as they enter the office in the morning, and at the same time they're getting dragged away to solve urgent issues or perform project work. And we're living in a time where there are more alerts and more threats than ever before, and something clearly needs to change. And thankfully, AI and ML-based capabilities are helping to secure and manage cloud infrastructure, sensitive data, and native applications that are deployed across these multi-cloud environments. So a big thank you to Nathan for sharing his insights today. I know that every podcast you listen to will have a message from your host telling you to please leave a rating and review. But in a world where we're all ruled by algorithms, it really does help the show reach more listeners. So please, if you've enjoyed today's episode, please consider leaving us a review. I always like to finish every episode by saying technology works best when it brings people together. And the fact that you tune in every single day further proves that point. So I hope you'll join me again tomorrow. But a big thank you for listening as always. And until next time, don't be a stranger.